Okay, so recording, and yeah, wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of quote unquote good code versus bad code. Something, and I tagged this to the beginning of the curriculum, but I think it's relevant to all. But I find a lot of people ask the question of, well, how do I know if I'm writing the right code, or how do I know if my code is good? Or I looked at the solution branch and I would have never thought to do it that way. I feel like I'm missing something, and such. So I did label this study group a discussion, so I want it to be more, hopefully, interactive. I guess if nobody speaks, then I'll just talk. But I just wanted to start out with kind of whoever wants to toss it out there, what you think makes code good or code bad. I want to kind of go based off of your guys' input, and have a discussion there. And I do have some examples of things that I'll pull up here a little bit and look at and discuss and see what you guys think about those things. But I think the discussion back and forth is going to be the best way to clarify some things, and why we think certain code is good or better or bad, or and where we get those thoughts from. So anybody want to tell me what you think good code is versus bad code?
Bad code doesn't work. Like it like you get to a web page and it's not functioning in some way where you need it, or the app's not working, or it's messy and like it's it lags. Like it's so much that you can't even get the page to load.
Okay. So let me actually keep running list going over here.
Well, I guess it seems from what my experience and what I've seen so far and learned is that, like, it could be on one level, like stuff related to syntax, right? So it seems like there's better ways of writing code just on the syntax level, and maybe, I don't know, like, worse or bad ways. And then there's also, it seems like functionality, I guess, if I'm, it's a way for me to put it, I guess, like, I mean, I don't know what good or bad we're referring to, because it seems like there's better ways to do something, and I don't know, like, for example, one of the things with Ruby, it seems like it's so flexible that there's so many ways to do something, and I'm sort of starting to see that there's some ways that are preferred and a little bit better, quote unquote. So I don't know if that qualifies as good or bad.
Yeah, right on. So, preferred methods and patterns versus less used methods and patterns, or code being messy or clean, or yeah. Anybody else?
Well, I think that something that I've come across is good code kind of shows the designer's intent. Like, I go back and I look at some of my early projects and I look at methods and I kind of like, what? Not really sure what I was doing there until, like, I go and I read a comment that was written after it or something like that. Whereas stuff that I try to write now and I go back to after a couple of weeks, like I'm revisiting my Rails project at this point, and I can kind of see what's going on a little bit more, because it's a little bit cleaner and simpler rather than just kind of, I don't know, like verbose, right? But at the same time, there gets a point where you get a little, I think you can become too cute with it, and like, oh, I can fit this method on one line, so I'm going to do it. But then you go back and look at it a month later and like, what was I doing here? Why is this? Why do I have all these methods or all these things chained together and things like that? So I think that there's a line between simplicity and then being like simple in a short, like the amount of amount of words you type or the lines that you use, but not being very clear in what you're doing.
Right on. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Well, if nobody else, let me actually have stuff pulled up right now from previous study group. Here we go. Okay. Show some code. This one. All right. Everybody see this gist? I can't see you anymore, so just throw something in the chat or somebody nod. You can see it. Okay, cool. So I think kind of towards what, let me move some of this stuff, what Dave was just saying, I think we start to get, especially as we get started, and it persists. I'll show something I wrote recently that was still kind of affected by this problem. But we try and be clever because we can. I think we like solving problems in interesting ways. So doing things very simply sometimes is, isn't, and I can paste this too, if you want to look at it. Doing things simply isn't as much fun, but ultimately, we also get things reinforced from the places that we go and the places that we look. So, we look at something like, or we're practicing for jobs and we're on algorithm sites and we're doing stuff like Code Wars or Exorcism and things like that. We're looking at solutions and we're seeing, quote unquote, best practices. And we're like, it's getting reinforced that, oh, we need to be the most clever. We need to do things, everything has to be on one line. I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. And that's why I said this is a discussion, because, if we can talk about some of this stuff. So here's an example that I pulled from Code Wars. And the problem is create a function that returns the sum of the two lowest positive numbers given an array of minimum 4 integers. I can probably make this bigger. There we go. No floats or empty arrays will be passed. For example, when an array is passed like this, the output should be 7. So it's adding 5 and 2. If it's this, then it should be that. And it says do not modify the original array, just because it won't pass the test. So if you look at, and these are things that I did back, I don't know when. I could probably look up whenever I wrote the code, but so I had a solution, which was to sort the numbers. I created a new array by sorting them, and then I added the 2 indexes. I was like, that's cool. That's pretty simple. I think even, as long as you know how to get an index from an array, I think probably everyone who's on here, unless, you've really just started and haven't gotten to arrays yet, could kind of figure out what's going on with that method. And then I look at, this, you see, once you pass something in a site like that, you can see all the other answers. And, this one got voted the most. This one right here, best practice. Numbers dot min 2 dot reduce colon plus. And I'm like, then I dive into trying to figure this out. I'm like, this is awesome. Like, I want to do this. And then I realized that I'm confused. And I started wondering, based on a talk I saw, like, is this good? And I was actually sitting down with a CTO for a company a couple days ago for lunch, just from networking. Somebody said, hey, 3-way introduction on an email, go hang out and, talk. And we were talking about this type of thing, and how there is there's a friction that comes with stuff like this. There's a visual stumbling block. There's a mental stumbling block where you have to think so much more to get past this quote unquote what is being called best practice because it's shorter. And is that really worth it in the end? And I think I'm thinking about it now. I'm pretty sure like my bias is showing through in how I'm talking about this. But what do you guys think? Like, do you think that stuff like this is just because, you know, we're newer at this? So would you hypothesize that something like this is not an issue after a year or two, you know, of writing Ruby code if we were in Ruby, or do you think that this, you know, would be better in the long term for, you know, just keeping up with it? Is there anything else that you think, you know, might factor into the differences between these two, just outside of, you know, the one is, I mean, one line longer than the other?
You know, one thing, like, I see everybody trying to avoid local variables. And I feel like the top solution, you create a local variable called sorted. And on the bottom solution, you don't. And a lot of times on the reviews, I'm getting that feedback. You don't need this local variable. Just, you know, pull it out of, you know, the argument passed in. So, I mean, if you follow that mentality, then maybe the bottom solution is better because it doesn't have a local variable.
And yeah, I think that's a valid point. You know, and I don't know the Ruby well enough to say this 100% for sure, but, you know, in the first solution, there is a local variable. So that local variable is going to take up memory. We're going to already have our numbers array as a variable, and that's memory. And our sorted one is going to be the same size. So we need more memory to do this, the first one, than we do the second one. And yeah, so I think that's a solid comment. And that's why I think this is a discussion, you know. I don't think we're going to necessarily agree or be able to decide which one is better, but I think the discussion of what, you know, the pros and cons kind of both is worth the talk. Anything else that anybody's thinking when comparing these two?
So I think that the best practice one looks a little bit more intimidating probably to us newer folks, just because we may not know all of the collections API. I know that when I was doing one of my code reviews with Cernan, he was asking me to do something that was going to require reduce. And at the time, I just had no idea what reduce did. So and when I was speaking with somebody who's been doing Ruby for like 10 years or so, and I mean his advice was to learn the collections API, like memorize it, because 90% of what you're going to be doing as a Ruby coder or whatever is going to be iterating over data. So I can see why it's the best practice, and I think I agree with that. The whole point of creating a local variable, not creating a local variable. I think that in something this small, it probably makes no difference. But when you're talking about production stuff, at some point you have to take that kind of thing into account.
Yeah, I was going to say that it seems like, especially starting out, like when we're told stuff about like dry, things like trying to, like the local variables, like trying not to deal with like state like that, right? It seems like with such small examples or limited examples, like you would see here, like near the beginning of the program, you, like it's easy to say like, well, I don't know. I guess they're both the same. Why one or the other? But from what I'm getting, like, it seems that as you write longer and longer programs, these things then seem to like apply more. I don't know, because I don't even know what it would be like to write in like look at the code base of like actual, production apps and websites. But I would imagine that these things sort of like become more important as you're dealing with way more code. So it's more obvious in that context than it would be to us. Like it's pretty much similar to what Dave was saying.
So the thing I think that stuck out the most with me, and when I was talking to this guy the other day, was he was talking about how we're the large majority of us, especially us, coming through boot camp, doing web development, aren't going to have to worry about, for the most part, the really, really complex, efficiencies. So he was like, he straight up told me, he said, me nor anybody that I know, at least in the Southeast, he said, unless you're in New York or San Francisco and targeting specific companies, he said, you don't need to know computer science. He said, we don't even test people on it because we're not solving Google problems. He said, everybody kind of watches talks of people and goes to conferences, and the people are, the experts in the industry are super smart, and they're working at these ginormous companies like Facebook and Google and stuff like that, Amazon. But the types of problems that they're solving are so past what the large majority of us are going to do that sometimes we're worrying about problems that will never exist for us. Which I thought was worth, I was like, oh, I need to write that down. I didn't have a pen and paper, but luckily I remembered it. I was like, because I want to mention it in this discussion. But yeah, let's continue looking at some more stuff. I have a Ruby example, I have a JavaScript example, and then I have a more JavaScript, but it's because I figured even though I tagged this at the beginning of the curriculum, there'd be people kind of from all over. I was looking. Okay. This one is looking, this one's a little bit more complex, but this one is talking about, also from Code Wars, but you're supposed to square every digit and then return it. So the example, if you run 9119 through, it should be 811181. So 81 is the square of 9. Then 1 squared is 1, 1 squared is 1, and 9 squared again is 81. So I'll show, once again, 2 pieces of code. One was how I did it at the time, and then the best practice, quote unquote best practice that's been voted up like, I think 100 plus times. So, and I actually wrote comments on this code, which was very helpful when I went back and looked at it. It's a hard thing to remember to do, but it is very helpful. So yeah, break up the number. So now this creates a variable with an array that would be 9119. Then a new array that's empty, then a loop that goes through each number of this new array and pushes them in, and then joining it all and returning it. And then this, which I can't say I can walk through efficiently right now. But it looks like it's taking the numbers, adding on the quotations, splitting on those quotations, which is basically creating this, new array, then mapping that array. So it's going to loop through that new array and return a new array. Map is taking function value, squaring that value, and after all that is done, just run and join on that to get that final value. So similar, but different, a little bit more complex now. And I think this goes a little bit towards what Dave was saying initially, where, you know, how many chained functions is really useful. I mean, it's definitely a very useful thing to do. I know I've helped some students specifically with the music library CLI lab, and that, you know, with chaining functions inside of that, and that was like awesome, and it was what was needed to solve those problems. But yeah, what do you guys think? Or any other things outside of just like, I think we've been through a little bit of the syntax and stuff with the first example, but what do you think, like, which one of these pieces of code, the top answer or the bottom answer, do you think runs faster?
I don't know about runs faster. Probably the bottom one, since it does have less constant declarations and things like that. But again, it's going back to what you said, and I've had the same conversation with people where they say some of the problems that they're talking about when you look at, you know, you're talking about Silicon Valley talks and things like that, never come up in, you know, most of what any of us would be doing. Another thing I talked with this guy about was kind of like, just because you can do something, like you can fit all of this onto one line, but then how much harder is it to maintain because it's on one line? What if you have to change something? What if something, and obviously this is a really simple example, so you know, you can't see like, what if you had to do, instead of square digits, it was cube digits or something like that? You know, which one's going to be easier to change and how much time is that going to take to fix? So I mean, I get why the best practice is the way it is, because it's the shortest one-liner, but I think that as far as if I need to go back and change this in the future, I would go with something closer to the first solution. That's me.
And something also to think about with maintainability is, and it's hard to get this viewpoint while in the program, specifically because we do very little like group work. You might pair, you know, but it's hard to sync up, you know, like 5 or 6 people on a project. Also, none of the projects are really big enough for that to be effective. But like when you're working in most jobs, there's going to be a team of, you know, and teams that can absorb and handle hiring junior developers are typically a little bit larger. And the code needs to be worked on by people of all skill levels, typically. To an extent, you know, there's obviously going to be more complex pieces of code and less complex pieces of code. But, you know, talking about, like we were talking about, like, oh, well, this is going to make so much sense for me 5 years from now. But what happens when you're the manager and you're like, hey, I need you to do something to the code? It might not make sense to the person that you're directing to fix this or maintain it or change it. And so there is a verbosity versus, I think I like to call it cleverness, balance that has to go on. I don't know if you've watched many Kyle Simpson lectures or anything. He's extremely opinionated, so some things you can take with a grain of salt, I would say, of his, but he's also very, very smart and knows his stuff really well. And he talks about, you know, writing code for humans. We're not writing code for the computers, like for the most, we're writing code for humans to come back and look at and read and understand and work on and maintain and do things with, and even for ourselves, our future selves. So being more verbose doesn't necessarily always hurt us. And I haven't tested it, but I know when I was doing algorithm challenges, preparing for job interviews, there is a specific site, Code Fights is where I did some algorithm challenges, and they're very much on the kind of computer science question challenges. And the code has to run in an environment, and they test the efficiency of the code. And one thing that I found was if you use something like a map, instead of writing a for loop, the map is less efficient. And that was surprising to me. You know, I assumed that, you know, I think because a for loop is bigger, you know, there's way more words here. This has to be less efficient than, you know, map, or run slower. And it didn't. I actually discussed that with Luke a little bit. And he told me, you know, these things aren't magical, you know, map is just a function somewhere in the JavaScript source code, or, you know, in the Ruby code that is doing this loop for us, based on the things we give it, you know? So you actually do lose some efficiency when you chain a ton of things together, because now you're calling two methods instead of just, or a method that runs a loop as opposed to just running the loop. And that's not always true, because we can also always write inefficient code, and the people who write programming languages write these methods as efficiently as they can be written. But you still can lose some things in that translation. Let me. Cool. I'm trying to keep up with the chat and what we're talking about. Cool. So let me show you a piece of code. This is React, so it's going to be more in-depth and more complex, but I just wanted to illustrate how kind of this, I think this problem persists past where we're at. So this is some React code. This is actually a sample code that I wrote when I was working for a company called Resli. I pulled it out to put it into my portfolio to actually show code that I had written. But something that I did, which I don't think is great, but I did it because it was quicker and we were on a time crunch, and it probably should be changed, but is this. So don't worry much about if you don't know what this is or how it works or what, or, you know, any of React works. Ultimately, I'm looking at, once you look at this, and this is throwing together two different things to accomplish something. It's way less writing, it's way less words, it's way less code, but it's complex to wrap your head around. I actually asked in a Slack network, you know, hey, I'm trying to do something in a React channel. Hey, I'm trying to, is there another way to pass these things? And they were like, oh, well, you can just, you know, use spread syntax and object destructuring to pass them all as they are, real succinctly like this. And I stared at this and I was like, this makes no sense. I don't understand this. And yeah, it's squashing together spread syntax and object literals and object destructuring, which are both really cool things on their own. When you put them together, I think they get really, really abstract. And I'm I would have to assume that my boss, who even at the time approved this pull request and this code, probably couldn't explain how that worked and what it was doing, and would have to look it up. But it's showing that I think I was trying to illustrate just a little bit how even as we progress and move on and get, into libraries and things, the libraries can allow us to do clever things with code and cool things with code that are actually more confusing, even, when we take it, because, the library is going to take things like when we look at something like procedural Ruby, something more like this, a library could take that and do something completely different with it once we give it the right stuff. So yeah, let's see. I had a question in here that was tossed to me about code styling. And that is all opinion, honestly, when it comes down to it. That's why there's so many style guides. The more, I guess, I don't want to say established, but like a lot of styling comes from just preference, and also from past problems that don't exist anymore. And I think that's where the differences come from. So I don't know if any of you have watched Luke on any of his JavaScript live lectures lately that he's done some, I think he did a Webpacker one that I attended, using Webpacker and Rails. And he was writing some JavaScript, and I saw he kept typing semicolons and then deleting them because I guess he's trying to stop typing semicolons. But at one point in time, let's see if we can find when it was, JS semicolon insertion. I know this hasn't been around forever. I know it's something I've looked up before, hence the purple link. Automatic semicolon insertion. I'm trying to see if it says when it happened. Either way, illustrating that at one point in time, semicolons were required. And I think they were required. If not, they're 100% required in C#. So it could be it could also be that, when you work in one language and it's required, and you work in another language where it's not, or let's say you have a C# backend that you're working on, and then you have a JavaScript front end, and you just start typing semicolons everywhere, and they work on both. You're saying, okay, let's make it standard that we want semicolons in both. And that's why there's different style guides. Like I worked with and used the Airbnb style guide, which has semicolons everywhere, and it has what's called hanging comma. So if you have an object that has a bunch of things in it, the last one doesn't require a comma to work. But with Airbnb, you're supposed to put a comma there, even though there's nothing after it technically. And there's reasons for that. And then, I wrote code throughout the whole program following what's called, or at least JavaScript, because JavaScript, I wanted a guide to follow using what's called standard JS, which is just another style guide. And there's no semicolons in standard JS in that style. So the same thing with indentations, tabs versus spaces. I believe at one point in time, white space caused issues. And there are some Well, there's some syntaxes, one being slim. Slim is like ERB. If you've been through Rails yet, it's another templating, I guess templating's right, system for Rails and Ruby. And there's no end tags in Slim. So the way it knows code blocks is through spacing. So your spacing has to be very precise in Slim. I learned because I worked with it and had never used it before and got very confused. But and then things like, I believe, YAML, if your spacing is off, it doesn't compile right. So because I think the crossover between things is why people are so particular about their code stylings. And that, in the end, I think comes to efficiency and maintainability as well. You know, if we say, okay, we have YAML in our project, and we have JavaScript in our project, and we have Ruby in our project, well, YAML requires 2 spaces for all indented things, so our code style is going to be 2 spaces is how we're gonna set up all of our code. And then we know that, you know, we're not doing 2 spaces in our YAML files and a tab in our JavaScript files and, you know, 4 spaces in our Ruby files. We just make it the same all the way across the board. And if I had to hypothesize, that's probably why some of these things have come into existence, because there was some piece of code or some language that was strict and enforced a specific style. But yeah, I think that's the larger crux of the things I wanted to talk about. I think the efficiency part is something that we all worry about, but shouldn't. I don't know if you've been to any meetups or listened to any lectures or watched any videos and seen people talk about optimizing too early before it's an issue, trying to optimize things. It's something that I'm told is kind of an agreed upon thing in development. Don't optimize until you need to. But I think it's one of those things that we can't not think about. We wonder
when you
about
say
it.
optimize, do you mean shorten?
It could be shorten or how long it takes to run. So let's say this code takes 30 milliseconds to run and this code takes 25 milliseconds to run. Is, after writing this code, is it worth it to figure out this refactor to save that 5 milliseconds? And like Dave was saying, you know, it's the large majority of the things we work on, it won't be worth it to save 5 milliseconds. I watched a video and they were talking about how React had optimized something in how they call them micro efficiencies because they're so tiny, but they had optimized like the rendering speed at one point in time, because it has like the real quick thing with React is it has a virtual DOM and it figures out what needs to change and it does it on its own. And it optimizes it all for you. But they had sped it up from like 15 milliseconds to 10 milliseconds or something like that. And like, that's good. That's a win. That's faster. The only thing is like the human eye can't see things that happen quicker than 30 milliseconds. So it was literally like, yeah, the code's running faster, but humans can't even see the difference. It's literally impossible for us to notice anything got faster. So it wasn't really worth it, was it? So thinking about like optimizing things just to optimize things sometimes is unnecessary. And in the context of work, spending that time for most companies isn't worth it. You know, we cost money when we're writing code. We're being paid engineers are being paid. We're being paid to create things and make stuff that works and functions. And if it's not causing an issue for, it being 15 milliseconds as opposed to 10, then we should be creating new things and making more value and ultimately making money for helping the business make money, because that's what employees need to do to keep jobs. The businesses we work for need to be profitable and making money. So yeah, that's what I meant by efficiency, if that's what I said. But yeah, I want to just kind of open it up. Thoughts, ideas, questions.
Can you at some point touch on like basic elementary, kindergarten, good code? like for the brand new people?
I think
like indenting, like making notes in your code. I see that they have notes here. My solution,
Yeah. Ultimately, I would say if you are, and I was hoping this discussion might ease some of those concerns, but I would say don't worry about good versus bad as you're starting, as you're getting going. Worry about the code working, like videos and everybody will say the red green refactor. Make it work first. That is the number one. Make it work. And then there's the step of make it right. And I don't know, that's kind of the philosophical one. What is right? It's what we're sitting here discussing, but, and outside of the whole, making things secure when you're dealing with user info, but that has to be right. But making it work. I've helped students who have no indentation in their code, and it works. The reason we indent code is because it helps us just kind of see scope, so we know that this for loop, it starts here and ends here, and the stuff that's indented further is inside of that loop. But I mean, I guess this could be at the beginning of the line and be just fine. And you'd still be able to see that it was different. Also, depending on companies that you end up working for, there are companies that have enforced style guides, but when the code gets sent from your local machine to either GitHub or whatever version control system is being used, it'll go through a process of formatting the way that your manager will want it formatted. I know people who work in situations like that. So they say, you write code however you want, and then on, not compile, but on commit, on push, it gets pushed through a build process type thing. And it conforms to the company style. And the company style is typically set by the lead developer. And yeah, it all is taken care of that way. So really, whatever works for you. These types of conventions of, 2 spaces versus 4, tabs versus spaces, those types of things are really like everything could be over 2 more spaces, and well, this isn't an IDE, so I can't just move it over. But that type of thing is really individual. Like I said, I did the entire JavaScript curriculum with Flatiron without semicolons, and it was fine, and I got through it. And but every example in the curriculum had semicolons, and that didn't necessarily mean I was writing bad or wrong code. It was just different. What's it called? Elm does this weird thing that I think is kind of cool. But some people, but it's really weird to look at. What's it called? Let's just look for a code sample. Let's see if we can find it. Just need something that has. Now, if you were to use something like Elm, Elm has an enforced style guide for the entire language. And actually on save, it reformats all of your code for you. So in that sense, there would be something that you had to follow. Yeah, here it is. They put the comma at the beginning of lines, which is different. And I actually asked Luke about that when I learned about it. He said, never do it, because he just didn't like it. And he was my instructor, so I didn't do it. But you can do that, and it works. And I actually had someone explain to me why they do it that way. It's because when you change the code, if you add another line to this, you're only changing this one, the next line. However, if you were to put a comma at the end and add a line, you're changing 2 lines of code. So they're like when you diff, code diff in GitHub, and it shows you the things that have been changed, you only see the line that has been changed and added, as opposed to it saying that 2 lines have changed, which I guess is useful. But yeah, like, and Elm compiles down to JavaScript. So in the end, this is turning into JavaScript. And, you know, I mean, this is JavaScript to an extent. But yeah, there's no hard and fast rules on that. I say just follow the examples. You know, over years, code has been written indented for a reason. It keeps it organized. It lets you know where things start and where they end. So you can line things up. You know, this method starts here, and it's easy to find where it ends. And you know, everything inside of this method is 2 spaces over. So you know, everything inside of this method has access to the arguments that are passed into it. And as methods and functions get more and more complex, that nesting that you can get into, you know, gets complex, and you want to be able to keep track of it and know, you know, like here are some fetches. You know, you want to know what has access, where does response go, and what has what. So keeping that indentation is very helpful. But as far as the actual style goes, it can change. I hadn't used Airbnb before, and now I know it. But that doesn't mean that the next person I work for might want to say, you know, down with the semicolons. Let's use standard JS style and run all your code through that. And you can learn that too. There are linters out there that will enforce things for you, so you don't have to worry about it. I installed an Airbnb one, and in my IDE, I would literally right-click. There was a fix all. I was using ESLint as the linter, and you just give it a config. It said fix all ESLint errors, and I would write all my code, and I'd right-click. I'd say fix all my ESLint errors, and it would automatically tab and space everything, and it would put on all my semicolons if I missed any, and such. But really worry about the logic as you're starting out. Worry about solving the problems, making it work. Don't worry about if you put 2 spaces or use tab. You know, that type of stuff is periphery, and there's lots of tools out there that will automate it for you. And they're also up to the opinion of your bosses in the future. So ultimately, I wouldn't get so hung up on something, because you could be forced to do it differently in the future. Anything else from anybody?
No, I just asked because when I put my code in questions and stuff, some people bitch. Oh, you didn't do this the way I like to read it, you know. So that's happened already.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly why I was saying your future bosses will say I don't like the way this looks, so we're doing it this way. So it's really knowing how to be flexible on it. It makes sense. It is easier to parse, I think, indented code or properly indented code, but it doesn't mean you have to do it. It's still going to run. It's still going to work for Ruby and for JavaScript at least. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for hanging out and chatting and talking, and hopefully learned something and pulled some stuff from this discussion. If you have any other questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to reach out. If you thought this was good, let me know. If you think of other questions, yeah, shoot them my way, because probably try and do this maybe once a month, this discussion, because there'll always be new students and we'll always be kind of able to discuss this topic. I don't think we can ever come to an end of what is good and what is bad.
I think it'd be cool to look at different styles too, some more
Okay,
in the future.
gotcha. All right, let's stop this for now.